G'day, and welcome to the Sea Creatures podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. Each episode, we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interacted with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists to divers to underwater photographers, citizen scientists, and people that have an intense passion for marine life. My name's Matt Testoni, and I'm all of the above. And joining me for this episode of Sea Creatures podcast is Kade Mills. He's a marine biologist with the VMPA, and today we're going to be talking about sea dragons. Welcome to the show, Kade.
Thanks, Matt. Should we timestamp this and say that it's into stage 4 lockdown in Melbourne and neither of us has been in salt water for a couple of weeks? And this is our way of getting a fix, reliving the glory days.
Talking about the sea creatures rather than seeing them.
Yeah. It's always nice to reminisce. It's almost as good as being there.
So, sea dragons, you are the sea dragon man. When I think of sea dragons, I'm like, yeah, Kade is the man. So why have you got such a passion for sea dragons, and why have they become your kind of animal?
I'll start off first by saying I think there's a lot of sea dragon people out there. And when I think of it, I think of a few other people such as Pang Quong, David Booth, and there's a few others around that have done probably a lot more work and understand them a lot better than I do. But as you said, this is about, I guess, sort of the passion project and the things that you're into. And I grew up in Victoria. I learnt to dive in Victoria. I never saw a Weedy Seadragon in Victoria. And then I moved to New South Wales to, I guess, start my career as a marine scientist. And while I was in New South Wales, I lived in Cronulla, and one of the areas that's renowned for Weedy Seadragons is the place where Captain Cook landed, just inside the heads of Botany Bay, a place called Inscription Point, and it's renowned for Weedy Seadragons. So I live very close to that. So when I got there, I thought I'd go for a dive and try and see these things. And I think, like most people, it's the word dragon that gets you. You expect to see something that is, I don't know, follows along the Hollywood mythology type. This big thing's going to be underwater and it's going to have all these amazing appendages and it's going to look kind of scary. And then the first time someone pointed one out to me, I'd already swum past 5, and they finally stopped me and pointed one out. And I think I was a bit underwhelmed to begin with, to be honest. I had the idea of a dragon. I'd seen photos, but they were a lot smaller than I expected. But then it's that thing where you take your time and you look at them. The best thing about them is that they don't swim very fast. So you do have plenty of time to sit and enjoy them. They're one of those creatures, like everyone kind of dives for a different reason. You know, some for whether it's an adrenaline, it's a deep dive, it's to get the perfect photo, it's to see a particular species. I find the thing about the Weedy Seadragon that I love so much is they're quite centering. They're very calm. They tend to be pretty relaxed. They're not moving at a fast pace. And it kind of forces you to do the same with your dive. It sort of slows you down. It gives you time to observe and watch them. So since I saw my first one in Sydney there, I continued to dive there as often as I can to see them. I was beginning a career as a marine scientist, and it's one of those things where you come out of a degree and you think you know so much because you're a marine scientist now. And once you jump in and start sort of interacting, and look, I know scientists that don't even dive, which amazes me, because it's like, well, how can you really understand what it is that you're looking at without being in the water and being surrounded by these things? But there's a lot of different ways to learn. And it was that, I think, the moment when I was diving with them as I realized how little I know and how I've only really just embarked upon the start of my career, and everything I thought I knew up till then was just a small amount. So I've sort of gone from there. I lived in Sydney for quite a few years. I dived with them. I ended up becoming an instructor for a while. And the highlight was always taking people to a dive site where they could see a Weedy Seadragon. Although people really wanted to see seahorses for some reason, they're meant to be cuter. Maybe there's just more Hollywood moments with seahorses. I don't know what it is, but I find the dragons much more interesting. But I guess that's where it started, and then it's evolved to the current work that I'm doing now in Victoria.
And so if people don't know what a sea dragon is, can you, how would you describe a sea dragon?
Well, it's not all those things that I thought it was going to be. So it is not big. It is probably a bit bigger than the length of a ruler is a good way to describe it. They look like a bit of kelp or a bit of weed that is just drifting around on the bottom. And they do a really good job of mimicking kelp in its environment. They move with the flow. I think is it from the Karate Kid when they say like flow like water? That is how they move. If the surge is pushing against the kelp, the Wheaties will move in synchronization with the kelp and move back and forth. They sort of have this really graceful movement where they go with the flow, which is partly because their swimming appendages are so small, they can't really swim that strongly. But they just look like a bit of kelp with a whole lot of fins hanging off them. And they're mostly snout. They're a big snout and a big belly. Using a highly scientific term, they're not squishy. So most fish have a bit of flesh to them. That's the bit that people go and catch them for, is to eat the flesh. Whereas Weedy Seadragon just seems to be all skin and bone and skeleton and snout. So they're a very odd. And I'm sure if people are listening to this now, they've either seen one before or they've already jumped online to see what they look like, and that'll probably give you a better idea. But they are one of the strangest looking creatures in the sea, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, everyone kind of knows what a seahorse looks like. And I always kind of think of them as a seahorse that instead of floating upright has kind of weirdly turned into like a bit of a, four-legged, animal kind of situation. And it kind of then floats. And so I think that, you spoke earlier about the dragon part was underwhelming. And it is underwhelming until you think of, I always try to think of the little crustaceans that they eat as people. And imagining a dragon floating above. And then you're like, wow, these tiny little bugs, are kind of going about their life in the forest that is the kelp. And this dragon, huge sea dragon, swims over and as you just said, it's all snout. And so it kind of, puts its head down and just sniffs them all up in a way. So
thanks, Matt. You've now changed diving with Weedy Seadragons for me forever. I'm never going to look at it the same. And you see those swarms of mice and shrimp, which is what they are. They're similar to brine shrimp or sea monkeys or whatever people want to call them. And that's what they mainly feed on. But you see clouds of like thousands of those things. And yeah, dragons just hovering around, picking off the people one by one. That's a great image.
It's like like a medieval town, everyone's running for the hills, all these mice, and this sea dragon swoops in and comes out of the kelp magically into the pack of mice and shrimp, and off it goes.
Well, it also has that thing where once it gets past its sort of juvenile phase, there's not much that eat it. As I said, it's all skin and bones, so they're not really a prey item for many things. So they do almost have that invincibility of dragons. No wonder the mythology in the name just suits it. The more we talk, the more we'll get into this.
Yeah, and I've always thought too that they do, because the way they hover, they do look like a bit of a dragon. And I feel like it's strange that people kind of came up with this idea of this winged monster that flies overhead before they would have seen a Weedy Seadragon.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that. And I have a feeling like the times that they'd probably come across them would have been just washed up on the beach, because it's not something that I guess early people would have been in the water to see, given sort of the habitats they live in. And then there was one of those things in the lead up to this podcast, I thought I'd do a bit of research on a few things just to make sure I didn't sound too silly. But one of the cool things that I came across is, so William Gould was a early painter in Australia. So there's the book, Gould's Book of Fishes, out there. And so what I didn't realize, he came to Australia in 1827 and he was actually a convict. So he came across because, as probably all good painters at the time did, he was forging banknotes. And while he was here, he started drawing a lot of the marine life. He was fascinated with the marine life that was around. And so one of the things that he drew was a Weedy Seadragon. And it's one of the, I guess, the earlier illustrations that we have to sort of know that where they were and where they were found in the early days. So there you go. There's my little bit of random trivia for you.
It's still a bit of an iconic image to this day. You still see it floating around when you have a look at Weedy Seadragon photos, Weedy Seadragon art. And a lot of them are almost copies of Gould's original, which is cool.
Well, and the thing is too, I think he took some artistic license with some of the appendages in adding a few here and there, and even with the Victorian state emblem. So the Weedy Seadragon, or also known as the common sea dragon, which is nowhere near as cool a name, so we won't be using that one anymore. It is the state emblem. So we have like a floral emblem and a terrestrial faunal emblem, and we have a marine emblem, and the Weedy Seadragon is it. And the drawing that is used for the on the state government site is actually anatomically incorrect. So I have a feeling they might have just ripped off Gould and copied his mistakes as well.
So we discussed like it's the marine emblem, and that's because a huge concentration of them are found in Melbourne and Victoria, and they're only found off the southern coast in kind of the Great Southern Reef of Australia, which is fascinating. And tell us what kind of habitat you look for Weedy Seadragons in.
Good question, Matt. And it is actually something I'm planning on working with a bit more with a scientist from Parks Victoria, because she asked the same question, in that they're generally considered to be associated with kelp forests. So again, the diving in New South Wales, I found them with kelp. I haven't dived with them in Western Australia, but the photos I've seen have generally been kelp as well on sort of that southwestern coast. But interestingly here, places like Flinders here, there is not much kelp in Western Port Bay, and in the areas where you find the Weedy Seadragons, it's more a seagrass. It's called like an amphibolous seagrass. And that is where you'll find them, but it's also where you'll find their food. Portsea has a mixture, so it does have a bit of kelp because there's a bit of reef there, but it also has quite large beds of amphibolas too. So one of the things we plan on doing is looking through a lot of the images that have been submitted by various divers and looking at the substrate that is behind them to get an idea of where they're generally occurring. Tends to be kelp. If you're in New South Wales, look around the kelp habitats. They tend to be on the reef edge, so they won't be in amongst the reef. They tend to live more on that interface between the sand and the reef. And it's sort of similar here, even with the seagrass beds, in that they're basically, like most things, they're where the food is. And that is where you'll find those swarms of shrimp. If you find the swarms of shrimp, look closely and you'll find a seahorse. You might find pipefish. You'll see something in there that's feeding on them. So they tend to live where the food is, and that is where you have the greater concentrations of food.
And you just mentioned like all the photos and like looking through photos. And that brings me to one of my favorite things about sea dragons is your project called Dragon Quest, where you get to take a photo of a sea dragon and find out its name or name it. So talk us through like Dragon Quest, what it is, and some of the cool like names and some of the cool finds you've had.
So it started with an article that I saw on ABC Online, and it was basically some researchers in New South Wales from UTS, David Booth and Sal McClantine, and a research group called Underwater Research Group, strangely enough, based in Sydney, who were using the patterns on the side of Weedy Seadragons like you would use a fingerprint. Each side of the Weedy Seadragon is different. So if you have a look at your thumbs, you will see that your right and your left fingerprints are quite similar, but they are different. So they will use the images taken of both sides of the Weedy Seadragon, and what they do is they map the spots. So this has been used with manta rays, it's been used with whale sharks, and now it's just been shrunk down to be used with Weedy Seadragons. And they map the spots, it gets entered into the software, and then what happens is the next time that you take an image, you map the spots, and the software will automatically do a comparison to see if there is something that has a similar arrangement of spots. And then what it'll do is spit out and say, check out this image. 10% likelihood that it's the same thing. And you work your way through and you either find it again and you're like, oh, I've got a match, or you go, oh, I've got a new one that I need to add to the database. And so what I've been doing in Victoria is using some of the work that they had already done. So they'd been down to Victoria and taken photos at Flinders and Portsea and entered dragons into the database. So building on top of their work. I've been using photos that I've taken myself, but the coolest part has been I've been using a lot of photos that have been sent in by people such as yourself, who are really good photographers, which make my work so much easier because the shots are always so crisp and really high resolution. But also just I've had a lot of snorkelers send in shots of ones that they've seen, and various divers and people of all sorts of skill levels sending in their shots. And a lot of the time I've been able to work out whether it's a new Weedy Seadragon or it's a repeat offender. And what I'm starting to discover is that particularly places like Flinders, a lot of people go there, but there's a couple of Weedy Seadragons that are just there all the time. They've just been spotted so many times that I've got to know, I don't even need to put them into the software to know that is Alice. And I have seen Alice so many times. And Alice is named after one of the first people that helped Bruce Alice, who's involved in the Scouts in Victoria. and he does underwater scouts, which is a really cool thing to do, basically getting kids into the water at a really early age. And he's been taking photos since the project began. And so Alice has been spotted, I think we're getting close to 20 times over the last couple of years. So what that tells me is that Alice is pretty much hanging around the pier sort of the whole time. So we're starting to learn a lot of stuff about their residency, their movement, but best of all, we will be able to use it to get an estimate of the population in these sizes, in these areas, given that we will have these repeat sightings and we will have these events where people are going out and sampling at different times. So from that, you're able to get an estimate of the size of the population, which is pretty cool just from photos. And so it means that you don't have to disturb the animal in any way. A lot of the times people will do tagging, which is to put a physical object on so they know what it is. But with this, you can just take a photo. So it's some really cool work that's been going on for a couple of years now and building a really good database of images. And I'm starting to see a lot of the same old dragons. And given I'm the one who's doing a lot of the processing, I'm really getting to know them quite well. It's starting to scare me a little bit with images coming through. I'm going, I know that one. And sometimes I'll have the name coming off the top of my head. Other times it will just be a quick search through and away we go.
You've just got to wait for the day where you're diving and you don't need to take the camera. You'll just be swimming along. You'll be like, oh, I know that's Alice. Recognize her.
I have done that a few times. There is one of my favorite is a Weedy called Scoresby, who's named after a guy called Scoresby Shepherd, who's an awesome marine scientist out of South Australia. I have a feeling he's in his 80s now. We've done a lot of that sort of groundbreaking, really early ecology work. And it has a split fin. So one of the dorsal fins on its back looks like a butterfly. It's got this sort of split in, this beautiful butterfly. So yeah, I see Scoresby and I'll take a photo from a distance. I don't even bother getting close because I know that's who it is. So yeah, it's starting to happen already. And I've had a few people comment that they're paying attention a bit more. And so when they are going out, they're like, I saw Alice today. He was hanging out there. So that is starting to go. And I love that. It's like part of diving is that, we get to visit these sites quite frequently. And, especially with some of the smooth rays, there's Stumpy and there's the albino smooth ray that comes in and people sort of form this connection with them. And it's great to be able to, again, do that with something like a Weedy Seadragon. It's great.
Yeah, and especially if a diver can get their name, or it's almost like adopt a sea dragon, which I think is just, really cool. They've got their names in their little community and they're harassing the mice and shrimp.
There are a few Maddie T. There's a Maddie T. I think there's a Maddie. There might be a Testoni in there. So you've got a few named after yourself, Matt. So if people are listening and they have photos of Weedy Seadragons, please get hold of me and send them in.
Yeah, definitely. And you may have your name on one, or not on one, but be named after one, which is cool.
Yeah, that's it. And people get excited when they get one named after them, but I think they get just excited to know that it's been seen previously and to get a bit of a story about it as well. So every time anyone sends one in that's been reseen, I will either put up on Facebook or send them an email personally to say, look, you just saw Heidi, and Heidi's been seen 10 times in the last 5 years generally. And what I'm starting to notice by doing that, it's actually quite good for myself in that there are some individuals that are only being sighted at certain times of the year. So in the warmer months, for example, we might see a few more males that are only ever spotted in that time. And then in the colder months, they're just not seen, or there might be some females that are starting to be seen in June, July, August. They're sort of seen around them, but they're not sighted again. So whether it's they're not there or people just aren't taking the photo, it's really hard to know that. But by people sending in their images and me taking the time to go through, I'm actually starting to learn a lot about himself. So it's great for the people sending in the images and it's great for me.
What's the craziest thing or the best thing you've seen in an image of a Weedy Seadragon, or what really sticks in your memory?
My favorite is seeing a Weedy Seadragon. The image I have of a Weedy Seadragon doing a poo. It was it was caught by Chris O'Keefe from the Underwater Research Group in New South Wales. There's a picture of me in the background. So she's taken the photo. I'm in the background. I didn't realize at the time, but it's that thing where I was mapping the spots. And I'm like, what? That's just like, when the goldfish have a poo in the tank. That's exactly what it looked like. And only time I've ever seen it. So that's a highlight just because I'm childish. But there's a few other ones that I find quite interesting. There's a few with some isopod parasites on them, which I've noticed a couple of times. And a few times I've seen clingfish as well on the fins. So you get the photos through and there's these little clingfish on the dorsal fins mainly. I've also seen double appendages. So you have two fins at the top. They're called your dorsal fins. And you have the fins sort of coming out of the belly, which are called the ventral fins. I've seen on one particular dragon, a couple of images have come up, and they've had two where there should be one. So they're sort of coming out of the sides in doubles, which is quite cool. And the other is the stumpy dragons I've seen. So I've seen dragons with almost all their tail missing, but being sighted multiple times. So it's that thing where you're like, oh, well, they've all been females too, which has been quite interesting. But you think, well, how are they going to get around without a tail? And they get around just fine. So there's been some great stuff like that. And even I've seen some that have had wounds. So they've had, whether it looks like a fish has bitten them, or I've seen footage of seals playing with Weedy Seadragons before. And you can see clearly that it's pierced the skin and there's kind of a wound and its chunk of flesh has been taken out of it, or skeleton's been taken out of it. And then a couple of months later, it's all healed up and they've just got this slight deformity on their body, which also you see on fish as well. So it's been cool to see a lot of stuff like that. But the poo's still the highlight. That's definitely the highlight, yeah.
Yeah. And I just have to, I mean, I've spoken to you before about my highlight, but my highlight is definitely the dad dates, where there's like 4 or even like 2 groups of 4 males all hanging out together. And I guess the coolest part about it is we know they're males because we haven't touched on this yet, but Weedy Seadragons, the female actually lays her eggs on the male, which is crazy. And so, and he carries these, and they're bright purple, and he carries them around, and then they form these dad dates, which is crazy.
Yeah, we hadn't touched on that. And I guess that's something that everyone knows about seahorses, is that, you know, the dads are the ones that carry them around, whereas with the seahorses, they carry them sort of in their belly, in their abdomen. Where, as you said, like the Weedy Seadragons, they have them sort of out on their tail. Bright pink and sort of purple colors, amazing. And I know I've seen quite a few images, and you've taken some amazing ones of like the little eyes of the embryos developing inside the egg on the tail. So to be able to see these things externally is absolutely amazing. And the daddy dates is something I've seen a few times as well. It's like, what are they? The classes that parents have before they.
Oh, the birthing classes.
Yeah, it's sort of like that. Instead of a mother's group, it is that sort of daddy's group. They're all getting together and discussing how they're going to rear their kids and what's going on. And I've seen up to 8 males in one location. And it's been at Portsea Pier where I've noticed. And if you dive the pier regularly, or you've ever been to Portsea Pier, just as the L starts to turn, so if you head out from the shore under the pier, and then as you start to turn to the right, there's a section there that just seems to dip a little bit lower, that the sand's scoured out. And that is where I've seen, up to 8 sitting in the one spot. And I tried to capture it, but underwater photography is not my forte. I try and I try and I try, but I didn't quite capture that moment.
As long as you got the spots. Did you get the spots?
I got the spots. I got the spots of all of them. Yeah, it changes the way you dive. It's been something that's been great for me, because I've had a lot of people say, oh, there's heaps of them, or there's none. Like, it really varies. Like, depending on who you talk to, they will tell you completely different stories and it'll be about the same site. I mean, that's just natural variability when it comes to sites. Like, I've heard quite a few people say, Frankston Pier is the worst pier dive in the world. I'd never dive there. Yet I've been there and seen seahorses, pipefish, massive schools of bream and Australian salmon coming through, and garfish and juvenile snapper. And I had some amazing dives. And I've also had some really terrible dives there too. So it's that sort of variability. And I've been surprised every time I've dived, particularly at Portsea. The least I've ever been able to find is about 10 or 12, and sometimes up to about 20, sort of in and around that area. So it's that thing where if you're looking for them, you will find them. And I think people dive with different things in mind. So I think if they're looking for Weedies, they will tend to see more. If they're not, then they may not see any.
Yeah. And do you have any cool facts about Weedy Seadragons? I have one kind of cool fact, but do you have any cool facts?
Oh no, you kick off. What have you got for me, Matt?
I just love their neck muscles. So we spoke about before how they kind of pick off these little shrimp and they have a snout, and they do that by kind of sucking up the shrimp. But it's because they've got these humongous, comparative to their size, neck muscles that just hold all this power and give them real crazy accuracy. And Just reminds me of like a wrestler, you know, one of those classic wrestlers with a huge neck. And so that's my kind of like highlight of that most people don't know about.
I wonder if just like the rugby in New South Wales and the AFL in Victoria, whether they have thicker necks in New South Wales than they do in Victoria. Is that all right for me to say that?
All
Am I going to
part
get
of
in trouble? I think the thing I quite like about them is that they have a courtship. So a lot of marine animals, here's just a random one for you, not related to Weedy Seadragon, but snapper. So that everyone knows and loves and catching in Port Phillip Bay have been known to form almost like big gyres. So they get together in a huge school and they'll swim round and round and round in circles. And what the males and the females will do is they'll release their eggs and sperms into that, and it's kind of like a centrifuge. So it brings it all together. There's been photos of that. There's been photos in South Australia, but there have been images of it happening in Port Phillip Bay. And so it's not very personal. It's not, they don't get to know each other. There's no, dating period in the lead up. It's basically, as an animal, we are here to reproduce. This is how we do it. And a lot of marine creatures do it, will reproduce that way. There's generally no contacts, eggs and larvae in the water column. These chance events happen. Whereas with the sea dragons, they can spend a couple of weeks. I have a feeling Pang Quong has said, it can be like 2 to 4 weeks. They can actually spend, whether it's getting to know each other or, checking out whether the female's probably checking out whether the male's fit to be a dad, and they will dance. They have, we like to give human terms or human sort of actions to things. So they will have a courtship sort of dance. And so they will swim around each other. And as far as I know, there's only ever been one person that's been able to catch on video the female releasing the eggs to the male. And Pang has been amazing. It's just sitting up on YouTube. I'm sure you'll probably throw a link in the notes for this to go and see that. And it's the female and the male almost entwining, but semi kind of upside down and horizontal to each other. And the female, the eggs drop out of the body cavity and attach to the male's tail. And then he does a little dance, which is most likely fertilizing the eggs. And that's it. That's the only footage I think we have in the world of this occurring. And was filmed at Flinders, and it was taken by a local diver. So that's their courtship. Maybe it's the romantic in me, Matt, that enjoys that part of their life cycle. But it makes them a bit more relatable, I think. That and the male's tail, what it can do to accept these eggs. So the tails, as I said, they're mostly sort of skeleton. They don't have much flesh. But the tail, and you can see it probably starting in the next month or two, they start to become all like spongy and squishy. They sort of become, I think the correct word is turgid. So it's like they fill up with water and they become like a sponge. They sort of have that ability. And so when the eggs are laid, basically they suction onto the eggs in a way. And so they're able to carry them around. Because when you think about it, it's a pretty precarious place to attach these eggs. Like they're just sitting on the outside of the body. So you need some strength, or you need a strong bind between the eggs and the male's body. So to be able to carry these eggs around, and it's not just a handful of eggs too. It can be 250, 300 eggs that they're carrying around on their tail. So the fact that its tail can adapt to do that, I think is phenomenal.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen a photo of a Weedy Seadragon carrying the eggs, it is definitely something to check out because it is amazing. I find even when the eggs aren't there, as you said, the spongy, turgid tail, it's really crazy that they can lay all these hundreds of purple balls and they just stick there. And I've never seen one fall off. I've seen divers get a little bit too close, inadvertently, and a sea dragon, kind of swims away quite harsh or gives a bit of a flick of a tail to get away. And there's never been a problem. So it's amazing. But
I have a feeling in the footage that Pang has got, there is a couple that do, when they first attach, that do fall off. There's a couple then. And that, similar to you, I've never seen it. Then the other thing I have seen is fish trying to get a nibble on, I guess, what looks like caviar to them. And there's these bright, beautiful little bits of energy just sitting there. If they could just pick them off the tail of the Weedy Seadragon, they'd be tasty. So I've seen that before. So I haven't seen them be successful. The Weedies can move quite quickly if they need to. But yeah, they do a good job of holding them there.
Yeah, I always just think of them as brightly colored protein balls. If you're a fish and you see this big purple, egg, of course, I'm always surprised that no one cottons onto it. There's actually a seaweed kind of algae at Portsea Pier, where you've seen a lot of them, that looks remarkably like the Weedy Seadragon eggs. And I've always wondered if that's why the eggs are that color.
I had never thought that, but that is quite possible. It's using the coloration of something that's nasty to go, well, you don't want to eat me because you're just going to feel sick. So I thought I'll have to look into that one, Matt. As per usual, whenever I talk about this, I usually end up with more questions than I do answers, which is, I guess, the beauty of doing science. And the best part about doing this project is people send in images and it's just like, oh, I've never seen that before. Where do I start now?
Well, that kind of brings us to the end of our Seadragon episode. Thank you, Kade, very much for joining us. And if anyone wants to know more about Seadragons or Dragon Quest or the VNPA, where should they go? What should they do?
First place to start, I guess, is to jump onto the Victorian National Parks Association webpage, follow the links through to Reef Watch. We have a newsletter that we only ever put out if we actually have something worth talking to you about, so we won't spam you with information. We also have a We also have a Facebook page, which is Reef Watch / Victorian National Parks Association, and the Dragon Quest project. There is also a page that was set up for me by somebody else just because they really liked the project. Has its own private page, which is Weedy Seadragons Melbourne. So if you search that on Facebook, there's over 400 people now, and I'm starting to get a lot of images come through from that. And it's just a really great space for people to share their thoughts, their findings, the images that they're seeing of Weedy Seadragons. And I think in the lead up now, once we can get back out, so we've got another 3 or 4 weeks of lockdown to contend with. Once we can start getting back out there, I think we'll find a few Weedy Seadragons photos starting to come in from that. Or you can always get in touch with me at my email, which is just kade@vnpa.org.au. Thanks for the opportunity to chat to you about it, Matt. I could have kept on going for another hour or two.
Thank you very much for coming. Sea Creatures Podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by myself, Matt Testoni. You can see more of my photography on Instagram, Matt_Testoni_photography, and my webpage, mtunderwatermedia.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, and visit our Patreon account, patreon.com/seacreaturespodcast, to help support the show. Production assistance by George McGrath, and music by Dan Musil and his mind-blowingly good slide guitar. Tune in next time to hear all about rays with renowned author Nigel Marsh. This has been the Sea Creatures Podcast. Over and out.